So shall we start because we are running late? I'm replacing as moderator my friend Ambassador Salem, who replaced the previous moderator. We will be talking in this session about evolving cooperation and challenges in Eastern Mediterranean. And actually, when we speak about security, which is the main focus of our panel, there are so many things that come in mind, so many issues that emerge. We are living in a neighborhood that includes failed states or unstable regimes. Also, we have some hybrid players like Daesh, and terrorism is, of course, one very big challenge, not only for the region but for the whole of the world. The fact that the terrorist network has spread to many places around the world. We have, of course, the migration crisis, which is still with us and will probably continue to be with us as the movement of people and populations seems to me at least to be the new regularity of the 21st century. We have, of course, economic issues. We have some big states like Turkey, who do not play a very constructive role, to put it mildly, in the region. Given that, I'm very much looking forward, as the rest of the audience, to the interventions by four very prominent speakers, some of whom I happen to know. We will start, if I may, with Marcos Kyprianou, former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Cyprus, and also former EU Commissioner, somebody who combines a very good background, academic, with practice, because he used to be a practitioner. So, Mr. Kyprianou, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Phyllis. Actually, have done the introduction I was planning to do. This is working, right? I'm going to give the practitioner's point of view, having actually gone through this myself, drawing from my experiences from both sides of the European spectrum, both at the EU level as Commissioner, but also at the national level as Foreign Minister. And I would like to make some comments on the EU policies. I'm going to be critical, I have to say, but also some ideas for the future. Now, for the sake of time, I have cannibalized my speech, I have to admit, and also for the sake of time, I plan to read it just to make sure that I don't talk for longer than I'm supposed to. And I'm going to concentrate on the security issue. I think the energy aspect has been covered. Many interesting and important things have been said. On the other hand, in order to be able to exploit and take advantage of the energy resources and reserves, you need to have security and stability. So I'm going to work on that. And the first thing I will deal with is whether the Mediterranean, whether it's east or the whole, can be viewed as a common security area. Now, it's true there's been a lot of geographic links and in some cases even cultural links, but can we actually call it or can become a common security area? I will give you the answer at the end, just to keep the suspense going and keep the interest there. But I'd like to make a few comments first regarding the European approach when it comes to the Mediterranean, especially the southern partners. The first thing I'd like to say is that since 1995, the EU approach, the overall approach towards southern Mediterranean, whether it's the Barcelona process, the Union for the Mediterranean, the European neighborhood policy, it lacked adequate understanding of the region and its countries, and of course it lacked also a comprehensive strategic objective. And another shortcoming, which is rather ironic, is on one hand the EU tended to overemphasize and tends to overemphasize bilateral relations, overlooking the fact that many of the neighborhood's problems require a regional approach, but at the same time, ironically, the bilateral action plans between the EU and its partners are rather generic and not tailor-made for the specificities of each country. And this, of course, is not helpful and makes them non-productive. Also, there's a Eurocentrism in the way the EU deals with the region, and a rather naive effort, if I may say so, to export to southern partners European perspectives, approaches, and ways of doing things. And I'd like to say also that the Brussels approach towards the Mediterranean partners was designed for long-term engagement in a stable environment. Its instruments have not been geared towards the rapid change that characterizes many of the EU's neighborhood today. And in fact, it seems that after 2011, the EU policy towards the region is in disarray, with divergent priorities, such as cooperation on one hand in counterterrorism, but promotion of human rights on the other. Now, these are not necessarily conflicting with each other, but sometimes are difficult to reconcile. And then we have the concept of conditionality, which is a hotly debated issue, it's very controversial in the EU itself, but it affects and sets limitations as to the scope of relations between the EU and its neighbors based on political criteria. And this brings the constantly recurring question whether how can you reconcile political dialogue on one hand, but also cooperation on practical issues like security on the other. The EU, in its generic approach and one-fits-all policy, focuses mostly on trade and market access. And this again is a Eurocentric concept that deeper economic integration brings social and political stability and therefore security. Now, this was valid after the Second World War, and it's true that it worked well in the European Union, in Europe, but with the complications that exist in the region, I would say it's rather simplistic, and its applicability is of a secondary importance. So the question is how we deal with the security, how we can come forward on the security area. First of all, at this point, security seems to remain elusive in the southern Mediterranean, because even as a term, as a state of affairs, it has different interpretations in the region as well among diverse stakeholders in the region. Whether it's Israel or Lebanon or Libya or Jordan or even Egypt, there's a different priority and different approach on the threats that affect security. And if you allow me to refer to another example, the issue of Daesh, while most of the countries in the region deal with it as a security threat, there are at least one Gulf state, and Turkey, that does not consider it so. It's not a high priority. On the contrary, they deal with it as a pawn in a more complicated political chess game, with the prize being Syria. So for them, this is not a threat, it's rather a tool to achieve some goals. On the other hand, for the European Union, Daesh is a major terrorist organization threat, not only of its actions and what's been doing now, but also because of two aspects. One is the repatriation of foreign fighters that eventually will return and have started returning back to European countries, and they pose a threat to the national security of European states. But also, just equally crucial is the threat that Daesh poses to the European Union through the export of its ideology to European youth of Muslim background, usually. So we have terrorist attacks these days in EU countries committed by EU nationals who have pledged their allegiance to Daesh, even though they have never fought for it in any of the countries. And that means that now we have in Europe domestic and homegrown terrorism. Another issue which is important is human security. That must not be undervalued, even when we talk about hard security. And the considerations of human security affect hard security as well. And the fact is there are chronic destabilizing factors in the region. These factors are creating the conditions for a continuous threat to the stability in the region. I will not expand on that, but that's something also that has to be dealt with. So for the European Mediterranean states and the EU as a whole, it's important to have a stable, secure southern Mediterranean area, and more broadly, a secure and stable Middle East and North Africa. There are different ways of doing that, but I would suggest that a priority for the European Union should be to seek a comprehensive cooperation on security between the EU and the southern partners, a form of a new regional security architecture, constructed on equal footing. Now, I know this is easier said than done. There are many complications, and we have to build, though, on the fact that there is indeed already substantial cooperation on security between European states and southern partners at the bilateral level, but also there seems to be also an under-the-radar security cooperation both between countries in the region and some of them with Israel as well. The difficulty would be to have comprehensive cooperation between all regional stakeholders in a conducive framework whose deliberations will not be derailed by other considerations, and which would not be covered in a veil of secrecy. And security is perhaps the single most important common denominator today between the European Union and the southern partners, but also between the southern partners themselves. So cooperation could be mutually beneficial if a way is found to bring all the stakeholders and all the countries in the region together. So a framework could be flexible, or should be flexible, I should say, without structures that remind a formal organization or institution. I know there will be a big challenge for the initial meetings, so this could be done at a technocratic level with political backing, but without the burden of public opinion and political scrutiny. So this way we can overcome political problems that could prevent, at this point, an open cooperation. There shouldn't be any grand statements or terms of reference, except perhaps adherence to the principles of international law, that this would be prevalent in the cooperation. In a more strategic perspective, this cooperation could evolve into an effective regional multilateral framework, not only focused on hard security, but also expanding on political issues in due time. Now, this will not be an end in itself, it will not be an ultimate objective, but it is a possibility and a scenario that could be explored. And actually what the region lacks at this point is multilateralism. And none of the EU instruments, the ones I've mentioned earlier, Barcelona Process, UFM, or ENP, have actually managed to deliver this. Maybe that was not their target, but the fact is that the gap and the vacuum exists, so something new is needed to cover this need. So, coming to the conclusion, can we consider Mediterranean as an area of common security and stability? Is it uniting or dividing? Now, in my mind, in my view, other than its geography, and we have to be honest about this, the Mediterranean area is historically, politically, socially, and culturally diverse. So considering it as a common space is perhaps rather simplistic and naive. But diversity in this respect is not necessarily a bad thing. So we shouldn't disregard or shouldn't be afraid of that. On the contrary, accepting this reality, we can use this mosaic of concerns, ideas, dynamics to lead us to an objective identification of true convergences of interest on which, of course, we can build and develop effective multilateralism. And all this, of course, to create a secure environment for all the countries in the region. And I believe we have reached that point given the threats that exist, the level of instability that prevails in many countries in the region, and the threat that poses to the rest that don't have the problem at this point. So I believe this has instilled more pragmatism to all stakeholders and an understanding that more needs to be done so we can preserve and protect our citizens and our way of life and, of course, all the legitimate interests. So I believe that it is at this time of adversity that we can actually come up with new and fresh ideas. Societies, states can come closer and work together if they have common targets to find a solution. And in reality, beginning with this problem and this threat, we can push forward to finding and working on creating common solutions and cooperation on security issues. I know that it sounds as something elusive, something that will not be easily feasible, to have a multilateral, structured, regional cooperation on security. But given that most of the threats are common and given that the need is there, I believe that if there's a political will, then there can be the way to do it. And I would strongly promote this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As you realized, Ambassador Salem came right next to me, so he's pushing me in a way to give him the floor as the next speaker. And I will do it. You spoke about societies and civil societies. In my mind, Ambassador Salem, he is a pioneer, a civil society pioneer, and I presume that he has a very interesting proposal to bring, probably while concluding his remarks, about some kind of cooperation. A suggestion that he had an idea, an initiative a couple of years ago. Now I think it's the right time to bring it back on the surface and see be materialized. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in case you didn't notice, I conducted a soft coup. I saw that Dean Fahmy had something to keep him busy, so I quickly seized his seat. So just in case you're wondering how this has happened. I have 4 or 5 key points in my presentation. I'm going to try to be very brief and perhaps at the expense of clarity because it is a critical topic, and I think it's something that will require some stretch of imagination on the part of all of us. First, let me say that there is a huge shift in the nature of the strategic landscape we are talking about. So if you look at the kind of moment we are historically, with the defeat of Daesh, with the emergence today of a Kurdistani state, with the presence, if you look at the presence of the Russian presence in Syria, and the kind of agreements that have been signed, the basing agreements, and the US presence now with a formal base now signed for Israel. So we are seeing some really deep changes, and the question to us today is looking at the future in the next 10, 15, 20 years. How do the parties to this huge project in the Mediterranean, how do they defend these facilities? In other words, what are the key threats that we can imagine today that will threaten these facilities in the future? And when that threat materializes, will we be ready to respond to it? And let me break this down into 6 key missions that are required from the 3 countries represented here today. In an effort to move towards a more systemic degree of security cooperation. One is to agree on a threat assessment and build scenarios towards how to protect the key facilities that we've been discussing today. There is a trend towards a strong focus on non-state actors, terrorism, and radicalization. But there may be other scenarios we need to consider, and these may include things like interstate conflict, conflict between state and non-state actors, cybersecurity, and over-the-horizon threats. Second mission is to agree on a strategic concept, including an arms control regime for the East Mediterranean. Today, we do not have a common strategic concept that brings together the three countries that share this huge resource and this huge investment. Three, raising the level of preparedness through joint exercises, military exercises, planning, coordination with third parties, and rebuilding the humanitarian relief capacity. Fourth, third-party cooperation, and I'm particularly interested here in talking about both the EU, as you tackled the subject very well, sir, and the NATO, and I'll come back to this point shortly. 5, institution building, and that means thinking of a regional security arrangement for this part of the world, and transiting from the current security system, which is very much an Arab states system, which is not functioning very well, to a much wider Middle East system, and this is a big issue. 6th, capacity building, including preventive action, mediation, crisis response, stabilization operations, peacekeeping, and peace building. Let me move to the third part of my intervention, and that's looking at the kind of mechanisms and instruments available for these three countries to tap into. And if you look at the EU, one key document here is the global strategy of the EU. And that really has been translated into the European Defence Action Plan and what's called the Common Security and Defence Policy, the CSDP. And these include elements on conflict prevention, civil-military crisis management, and capacity building. And here there is a huge resource available, and that is the European Defence Fund, which will grow to be 500 million euro annually by 2020. Now, this is a fund that is there to fund research, weapons development, strategic planning, and I suggest that the three countries here today should be thinking of tapping into this resource to fund research and developing of strategic concepts. There is also, of course, a very strong partnership between the EU and NATO. After all, 22 countries in NATO are members of the EU. And there is an agreement signed at the end of last year delineating 7 areas of cooperation between NATO and the EU. Some of these are very relevant to the discussion of the kind and the nature of the threat and preparedness in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we're talking here about 6 or 7 elements: hybrid threats, and there is an EU center that works on countering hybrid threats; operational cooperation, very significantly, there is a special focus on maritime security, and of course the 2 operations, Sea Guardian and NAVFOR Med, one by NATO, one by EU. Cybersecurity, increased defense capabilities, and in the document there is a specific reference to neighbors in the south. Parallel and coordinated exercises, defense industry development, research and security capacity. So these are 2 of the mechanisms. So one is the EU mechanisms, including the special fund for defense research, and the second is the EU-NATO. There is also Union for the Mediterranean, it's going, to my mind, it's going to the secondary and tertiary kind of issues. It's not really tackling the security issues. It's looking at things like the Mediterranean, the environment in the Mediterranean, and so on. It needs a revival process, but that's something that can be worked on. Then there is the whole issue of a nuclear-free zone in the Mediterranean, and it's something that the three countries have expressed support to at various points. Significantly, in the plan of action of the global strategy of the EU, there is a reference to working on compliance with non-proliferation regimes. So there is an area of cooperation there in terms of pushing this agenda, which has been having some resistance, especially from various American administrations. There have been, and this is the fifth area of cooperation, there have been, of course, the joint military exercises, including the Medusa exercise between Greece and Egypt, and that seems to be going very well, mainly naval and air operations. We have one that has just concluded recently. Then there is, of course, the third-party joint maneuvers. So Greece has been involved also in Bright Star in the past, and also in third-party organized maneuvers. So, for example, the Jordan Eagle Lion exercise, both Greece and Egypt are participants there. There is a mechanism for coordination at the moment, which is the trilateral summits, and as somebody was saying, there is one that's coming up. I personally think that this mechanism needs to be developed a little bit more. There is a mention of something called a joint committee. I'm not sure the kind of how regular it meets, whether there's a provision for emergency meetings, for example, whether that kind of very heavy kind of body is the best way of coordination. I think we need a lighter mechanism and a more rapid mechanism and a more imaginative mechanism there. Let me just move then to some recommendations, and I'll close with those. One is, I think there is a need for the three parties to work on a joint study of threat scenarios, and another study on the components of strategic cooperation. I think that whole area is still submerged, and it needs to be further discussed. I think there is a huge potential for the three parties to cooperate in the whole area of peace building, arms control, preventive diplomacy. I think there's some potential there to be worked on. I think the fourth area or recommendation, I would say, is to mobilize resources available from both the EU and NATO. NATO provides 600 different projects of cooperation for non-member states. So even for Egypt, this is a great opportunity to tap into this potential. And now we are using perhaps 30, 35. Egypt is working with 30, 35 of these projects out of the 600 that are available. There is a need to underpin this cooperation with a kind of intercultural dialogue. I think we forget that we need to explain this cooperation to our populations. If you look at the kind of the results of the election in Germany yesterday, you can see that the policy on migration, or Merkel's policy, is not explained and is not supported by public opinion. So you need to underline these kind of huge historical steps by some work, bringing in civil society, NGOs, young people, media. And finally, my proposal has been to organize an in-depth seminar between the three countries. We had tried, Professor Phyllis, myself, and some other friends, Magda, we had tried to organize this a few years ago. It didn't work, but I think the proposal is still there. We had brought in the Biblioteca Alexandrina as a partner. So there is a potential to do this, and I think with this get-together, we really have energized the process, and we have obviously tackled many issues that require more in-depth treatment. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Professor Papasoteriou. He's one of the most well-known academics, not only in Greece. He's really a cosmopolitan. He has a German origin. He studied in the States. He's dealing with China. And this is, if I'm not mistaken, his first trip to Africa, though, but certainly not the last. And he will be talking to us about factors of stability and instability in the Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, he's also the president of the Institute of International Relations, which is one of the co-organizers of this half-day event. So, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a real pleasure for me finally to make it to Egypt. I've been planning this for a long time, and I certainly hope to come back again. Now I'll start with instability, the bad news, and then I will move to the good news. The greatest factor of instability in the Eastern Mediterranean in our days is the regional confrontation that began in Syria and expanded in Iraq, Yemen, which pits on the one side a coalition, a rather tight coalition, compact coalition led by Iran, which includes Shia factors in Iraq, the Assad regime, Hezbollah. And on the other side, a rather heterogeneous grouping of forces that not only fight the Iranian coalition, but fight amongst each other as well, complicating the picture and making this source of instability very protracted. Because on the anti-Iranian side you have Saudi Arabia and the other emirates of the Gulf who are very sensitive to hegemonic ambitions by Iran. You have Turkey, but you also have the Kurds in Iraq and especially in Syria, who in the last 2.5 years have become substantially autonomous, supported by the United States, and that creates threat perceptions in Turkey. Then you have the Muslim Brotherhood, which is supported by Turkey and Qatar. Qatar, which has transformed the Arabic language, Al Jazeera, into practically the propaganda wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. Right. And this creates friction between Turkey and Qatar on the one hand, and then Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the other emirates, apart from Qatar, in the Gulf. And you also have the Salafists, who are more extreme than the Muslim Brotherhood, and they include Daesh, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and complicated things, even fight with each other, right? So we have civil wars within civil wars, a very complex picture. And because of the involvement in this originally Syrian civil war, of these regional factors, neither side prevails. I mean, if one side loses, outside forces will support the losing side. And of course, it also involved, well, the West, right, supporting some of the anti-Assad forces, and Russia, since 2015, supporting the Assad side. Very complicated and protracted conflict, and no end is really in sight, right? I mean, as soon as Daesh is defeated, then the sides that are now fighting Daesh will turn against each other. So you have a situation that seems to have no end. People in the United States blame Barack Obama for letting this situation get out of control, for not enforcing his red line in 2013, for not imposing stability, right? But he argued, perhaps convincingly, in the beginning of 2016, that because of the energy revolution, meaning the development of sustainable means of producing energy as well as fracking in North America, the West doesn't, or the advanced world doesn't need Middle East oil so much as in the past. And therefore, you know, he indicated why bother in a sense, right? I mean, if it doesn't affect us directly, and the Syrian refugees don't go to the United States, they go to Europe, so it doesn't affect the United States directly. So he decided that he would only support anti-Assad forces from the air and not impose an American sort of Pax Americana on the region through a heavy military presence on the ground. Now, this is the largest source of instability and the most intractable. Of course, you have standing issues, the Israel-Palestinian issue, which doesn't seem to have a solution in sight. Then you have an increasingly erratic Turkey, from a Western point of view at least, right? supported ISIS at some point, either directly or at least indirectly tolerating smuggling. And then opposing the Kurds, who have been a strong factor supported by Western powers. Increasing tensions with Israel for a while, right? And of course the continuing issue in Cyprus, the occupation of more than a third, and the frictions in the Aegean with Greece. Our strategy, the Greek strategy regarding Turkey, was open the doors to Turkey's accession to the EU. This was a kind of regime reform strategy. If Turkey was to become a viable candidate, she would have to implement so many reforms that she would become Europeanized, and thus a more pleasant neighbor. But unfortunately, in recent years, this policy is failing, and it's failing because Turkey is evolving in a ever more authoritarian direction, away from European norms, right? And thus the accession prospects are dimming. And this frees Turkey to behave in a more erratic way. I'm not saying that it's dangerous at the moment in the Aegean, but the hopeful prospects that we had 15 years ago are not there anymore. Now, to look at the positive side, we have the various what we call triangles in the Eastern Mediterranean. The one is Greece, Cyprus, Egypt. We talked about this in the previous session. I won't elaborate more. But I would like to add that there is also the triangle Greece, Cyprus, Israel. And I think these two triangles at one point ought to become a square. Find a common energy solution that involves both Israel and Egypt and Greece and Cyprus, perhaps with the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline, which may serve the needs of all these nations. Another hopeful development in the Eastern Mediterranean involves Cyprus and its bilateral agreements regarding exclusive economic zones, separately with Israel and Lebanon. Israel and Lebanon don't communicate. Formally they're in a state of war, right? But because Cyprus did these separate agreements, it helped them deal with an issue. I mean, they haven't agreed amongst each other, but at least by doing the separate agreements with Cyprus, they can proceed in exploiting their economic zones without having a direct agreement between Israel and Lebanon. Thus, we see these different forces in the Eastern Mediterranean. Someone pointed out that, and I conclude here, someone pointed out that the only time in the last 3,000 years that the Eastern Mediterranean had a sustained peace and stability was during the Pax Romana, right, when Rome imposed peace and stability. Well, perhaps if these triangles proceed and regional cooperation moves, not in the short term, perhaps in a more distant future, we may produce peace and stability on our own without it being imposed by an outside force. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. The last but definitely not least of our speakers is Karim Hagag, who is an assistant professor at the American University in Cairo, and he will be presenting the topic Emerging Threats and Security Challenges in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to take this opportunity to build on what the distinguished speakers in this panel have already mentioned, to suggest what might be perhaps the basis for a joint or common research and policy analysis agenda to deal with the various issues that or challenges that have been put forward for our three countries. And I think the three institutions represented here can form a very solid basis for that endeavor. These challenges are complex. They are in need of sustained analysis, deeper understanding, and the interlocking nature of these crises is of the effect that really requires a comprehensive approach in order to address them satisfactorily. I would like to take as my point of departure the need to focus on the Mediterranean as a common security space shared by Egypt, Cyprus, and Greece, as has already been mentioned. And I think this is important because if we look at the immediate priorities and challenges faced by Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus, we find our three countries have been preoccupied by very immediate and pressing challenges that have forced them to address these concerns away from the idea of the Mediterranean as a common space for cooperation and regional integration. The challenges already mentioned by Minister Kyprianou for the Northern European countries, the focus on the challenges from the Eurozone, the migrant crisis from the South, the political developments that have cast serious shadows on the future of the European project itself, the rise of populist forces, the anti-immigrant sentiment throughout the EU. These, I think, have led to a preoccupation with immediate policy challenges and security challenges away from the idea of the Mediterranean as a common space. For Egypt, this has been the same. The focus on terrorism, the challenge of regional conflict, especially in Syria and neighboring Libya, in addition to the urgency of the challenge faced by the issue of sharing the Nile waters with the recent policies adopted by the downstream countries, especially Ethiopia. All of these pose very serious and immediate challenges for Egypt and have led to a preoccupation with these pressing challenges in a way that hasn't been conducive to a focus on the Mediterranean as a common space, which I think has been mentioned by the various speakers as a priority that we should focus on. So before I suggest maybe the outlines of a common policy analysis agenda, allow me just to build on what the speakers have said by proposing three broad points. First, we are all familiar with the challenges or sources of instability facing the region. At the forefront of these are the issues of regional conflict, terrorism, the associated challenge of extremism, the urgency of restoring state authority with the pressures that are being faced by certain states and the collapse of state structures. All of these are well known. I think what is much less well understood is how these various security challenges interact with each other in very dynamic and complex ways. None of these issues exist in isolation, but they interact in very negative ways that produce ever more complex security challenges. For example, the prospect of state collapse in Libya, parts of Syria and Iraq, and elsewhere continues to produce zones of ungoverned space that have provided safe havens for terrorist groups to organize, to train, to spread their ideology. The intensification of regional conflicts and sectarian and ethnic divisions in the region in turn promote the rise of extremism throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Indeed, this is what has given the terrorist phenomenon that we are witnessing its dynamic quality. Daesh as a terrorist entity may face military defeat with the ongoing operations against their bastions in Syria and Iraq. However, the continued sectarian conflict and the continuation of the Syrian civil war may lead to the rise of another terrorist entity in the future. The humanitarian suffering, of course, has led to unprecedented waves of population flows, both in terms of migrants and refugees. These in turn have had a very serious impact on fragile state structures in the region, Lebanon, Jordan, the challenge also faced by Egypt in this regard. And finally, we have the widening scope of regional and international intervention in the region's conflicts, as has already been mentioned. The United States, Russia, Iran, Israel, Turkey, certain members of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Conflict Council, all of these have intervened in a very strong way in the region's conflicts. And this opens the door to the prospect of transforming the Mediterranean into an arena of great power and regional competition. And I think the implications of that is something that requires a further in-depth understanding. Secondly, I think it's very important to note the fact that the impact of these dynamics have been faced in a way that really transcends their point of origin. If we look, for example, at the political implications of the migrant crisis on the European political landscape, with the rise of anti-immigrant parties, the rise of populist movements, and I think we could see that reflected in the results of the Brexit referendum, for example, the election in Germany and the results that this election has produced. So I think the impact of these crises extend in a way beyond the borders of the region in a way that will be very difficult to determine beforehand. The continuation of high-profile terrorist threats in Europe as the terrorist phenomenon evolves with the demise of Daesh is also something that has a dynamic of its own. Third, perhaps the most significant strategic effect resulting from these trends is the reemergence of the North-South Mediterranean divide. And this may be an ongoing process which requires sustained attention and analysis. Today, we face the possibility that the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean are perceived by Europe as sources of threats, sources of instability, sources of radicalism, again, in a way that undermines the prospect of dealing or addressing the challenges through a common approach. And the associated danger or potential danger is the emergence of a kind of fortress Europe detached from the turbulent southern Mediterranean rim, and the detrimental effect that this would have on the prospects of region-wide cooperation, I think, are obvious to all. What I would propose, given this background, is an agenda for analysis and a policy study similar to what Ambassador Anis has suggested, that would really focus on three baskets of issues. First, I think there is a need to take stock of the emerging security dynamics in the Eastern Mediterranean. The most significant development here, of course, has been the changing energy landscape, as has been discussed throughout our meeting this morning. But this development in turn poses a number of fundamental questions that need to be addressed. What are the potential security implications of this changing energy picture? Under what conditions can this promote regional cooperation or alternatively produce regional security competition? How do these developments fit within the overall picture of global energy transformations and their associated geostrategic implications for the region and beyond? And the energy factor is, of course, one component of this dynamic regional context. What we also need to address, and no less importantly, are the issues of ongoing regional conflicts and the point I mentioned before about the potential of transforming the Eastern Mediterranean into an arena of regional and great power competition. Secondly, I think there is an urgent need to assess the track record of the conflict management.
You have 2 minutes.
I will end in 2 minutes, Mr. Chairman. There is a need to assess the track record of the conflict management and conflict resolution processes in the region thus far. To what extent have the political and diplomatic interventions aimed at addressing the region's conflicts in Syria and Libya, for example, proven to be effective or successful? Are there lessons to be learned from the European experience in places such as the former Yugoslavia, in Georgia, in Armenia? And third, and no less important, I would submit that there is a need for a thorough review of the mechanisms, the policy instruments, and the institutional frameworks that have guided the agenda of Euro-Mediterranean cooperation thus far, as I think has been elaborated extensively by Minister Capriano. I think the problem is that all of these challenges, all of these security concerns are emerging precisely at the time when the Mediterranean is suffering from an institutional vacuum to deal with these complex security challenges. And that I submit, requires a deeper understanding of why these mechanisms have failed to deliver on the promises and aspirations that were associated with them at the time of the creation, the Barcelona process, the Union for the Mediterranean, and I think, as Ambassador Anis had mentioned, the fact that the EU global strategy and the EU neighborhood policy have also lacked a sustained policy focus on the Mediterranean. So these, I think, are a host of very challenging issues that, try as we might to deal with at the formal level, I think they would be supported and would benefit from the type of sustained policy analysis and serious academic attention that our institutions can devote to these issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your thorough analysis. Magda, I suspect that we have 5 minutes for a Q&A, because we had, we are not running really late. We have 15 minutes to conclude, so we can give the floor to the audience for... okay. So, if you can introduce yourself and then raise a question or your observation.
Do you feel there is a role for the private sector to play in order to support and enforce the efforts expected by the 3 governments? Thank you.
Another couple of questions, and then we will answer them.
What about the role of the cyber security when we're talking about security in general?
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Izzat Saad. Just referring to what has been mentioned by President Papadopoulos and also Minister Capriano concerning the destructive policy of Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. As they mentioned, now any possibility for Turkey to join the EU is gone or dim, as Minister Capriano said, and I still believe that from the very beginning Erdogan did not want to join the EU. He used this as a tool to get rid of the military influence in his country. But this is not my question, actually. If we agree that, if we take into account the Turkish policy over the past 2 or 3 years, especially after the failed coup, if there is any possibility from the legal point of view or the political point of view to reconsider the membership of this country in NATO. I am aware, of course, of the fact that it is a very important country for the United States. I know also that from the official point of view, it is an European country as a member state to the Council of Europe, but maybe my question is just theoretical, whether in the treaty establishing NATO there is a window for suspending such membership, because we see that really the regional foreign policy of that country and also its relations with its immediate neighbors is really destructive. Thank you.
Let me just add to your comment that the upcoming NATO Summit in March 2018, if I'm not mistaken, was supposed to take place in Istanbul, and instead it is going to take place in Brussels. This is just a sign, a message, a very strong message to Turkey. I don't think that Turkey will be excluded, or although it does on its part serious attempts to be marginalized and isolated, and it has been successful to a big extent. My approach is that this is really difficult to happen, although there are circles nowadays which speak about this scenario, which a couple of years ago was out of the question, totally out of the question. But let's give the floor to the presenters to respond. So we have actually the following questions: the role of the private sector, the Cyprus security issue, and the destructive policy of Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. So let's start with Professor Papasoteriou, if you want, and then we can conclude after we go over the rest of the speakers with Mr. Kyprianou. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether Erdogan from the beginning was determined not to go to the EU. But certainly it changed at some point. I mean, at some point his priorities shifted. I think largely with the Arab Spring. He decided to turn to the Middle East, support the Muslim Brotherhood, to become a leader in the region. And then he became increasingly authoritarian. Right? And at the moment, it's not clear to what extent even the NATO membership is in question. For the first time, official American sources talk about the possibility of Turkey leaving NATO, perhaps joining the Eurasian Union. Even that has been debated, right? And we've never seen this before. This is unprecedented. And if you visit NATO, the headquarters in Brussels, the atmosphere is really frozen for Turkey. It's a frosty atmosphere. It's a very, very problematic ally, right? And so, and I'm not sure they will go so far as to rupture the relationship, but it's a very difficult, very problematic relationship at the moment. That's what I can say for sure.
I don't want to deal with the three questions. I just want to add something I dropped from my intervention, and that is just to note in the threat assessment and the preparedness, the huge shift in the composition of Egyptian's naval forces. If you look over the last 2-3 years, you see a big change in the composition, sources of armament, the profile, the kind of military equipment that is being acquired by the Egyptian naval forces. And I'm just saying that there is thinking.
Cover three issues. First of all, regarding the private sector. Here it's clear that in order for the private sector, which is a substantial part of every effort of cooperation, you need to be able to offer security and stability. So one will follow the other. I honestly don't see the private sector taking the lead in this, but it can help to build up afterwards, after the state actors create the environment of stability, security, which would make it worthwhile for the private sectors to step in. So this is a problem in the various countries in the region. We see that the political, not necessarily in hard security, but just political questions that exist, I would say instability or uncertainty, that would be the right word to use, actually prevent the private sector from stepping in. But it will be the actor will be the part where once there is a political cooperation and you create the right environment to take it from there on and move forward. Because states and governments do have a limit. Have I done something? They do have a limit as to how much they can do. Now, regarding cybersecurity, of course, cybersecurity is an integral part of any kind of security. It's, for some countries in the region, rather a new threat. For Western Europe, it's not. So it will be important to cooperate on this as part of the rest of the hard security issues that need to have a close cooperation between the various actors in the region and the countries of both sides of the Mediterranean. Now, Turkey, I agree with what has said before, that Turkey never really wanted to join the European Union. Erdogan, actually, sorry, I have to clarify. He never really wanted to join the European Union. He used it as to control the deep state, the Kemal system, the military, the judiciary. Under the pretext of democratization, he actually removed the old establishment and replaced it with his own. But one in politics, and this is my experience as having been involved in international affairs, one should not underestimate the personality factor, especially in the case of Erdogan. So his problem is that he didn't want the EU to reject him. He wanted to reject the EU himself. So this ego, this face-saving or arrogance approach affects his policies. He's making a whole fuss because the EU is telling him no, even though he would have rather said no himself. NATO, there is no really a legal possibility of expelling Turkey for what they're doing at this point. Nobody knows what they're going to do in the future. But at the same time, I don't think it will be enough political will and no unanimity in any event, because NATO decisions are taken unanimously. So there will not be enough political support, and there will be no consensus in expelling Turkey, which is I think would be the largest army in Europe, actually. So I think the member states of NATO, which is really a military alliance, doesn't have any political aspects of it. I think it would be very reluctant to expel Turkey. And maybe just mention very recently the purchase by Turkey of the anti-aircraft missile S-400 from Russia, which goes against the rules or the practice of NATO. So the U.S. complained, some of the NATO officials issued a couple of statements, but Turkey is moving ahead with the purchase of a very complex, sophisticated missile system that is not compatible with NATO. And that shows that, I think it's a message from Turkey towards NATO that you need us, we don't need you, which is something that they've been saying also for the European Union. And this is my concern, being in the region, that when Erdogan says we don't need Turkey, we don't need NATO, we don't need the EU, he actually believes it. And one leader who has this arrogance can be very dangerous for his neighbors. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Magda, if your micro works,
Yes.
it seems that it does, you can conclude.
We have had very fine projects. I don't want to start summarizing now all what has been said in order not to dilute them. We'll be writing the report and send them to you for further follow-up. However, I would certainly like to stress some of the projects which were brought up today. Firstly, what His Excellency Papadopoulos said, that and stressed that the only viable option to Cyprus is to start exporting now, to start cooperating now with Egypt, and that Egypt can really serve as an energy hub for which we are very grateful, and certainly this is an idea very dear to our heart, and we certainly would like very much to take up this, and I would love the press to bring up this kind of positiveness which came up, which emanated from this workshop, that it is high time for our three countries to come with really very pragmatic and action-oriented projects. We have had also certainly, and that the idea is that Egypt could think of signing a commercial agreement now with Cyprus so that we can connect Cyprus, so that we can connect Damietta and Cyprus. And this may be, I hope it will be taken up by the summit in Cyprus in November, and that it starts being concretized and operationalized. Certainly also the idea of Dr. Amr Sirajuddin to connect the national grids between the two countries through Port Said and Limassol is also a very fine idea, and he himself presented the follow-up in two phases. First, to start the benefits of such connection between the two grids, and then we can certainly seek together how to operationalize this project. A third one, also in the session of energy, was put forward by Dr. El-Bambi, and here he really stressed the idea that it would be ideal for students from the three countries to get together, to start getting to know one another at the level of education, at the level of coming here to AUC, and as AUC presents a unique petroleum engineering department, which certainly we would love to cope and with students from Greece and Cyprus. And another point which I would like to stress here is what what George Eleftheriou came up with, that there is finance for such an idea, that we can certainly have the European Bank as well as the Juncker Fund to try to help in this kind of a project for students from Greece and Cyprus to make benefit of the potential available at AUC in terms of petroleum engineering. So we also got from the floor a very bright idea of the three institutions to start urgently together a research team to present, to connect also with the trilateral summit on the proposals we came up with and further studies on these proposals. At the level of security, certainly ideas came up, and by Minister Kyprianou, and certainly he rightly pointed out to the domestic and homegrown terrorism in Europe. He rightly also spoke of the North-South divide, which Karim also Hagag stressed again. So the idea is maybe at the level of security, also the kind of research of joint research work and common study and common analysis would certainly be very appropriate and very appealing to our three institutions. And I certainly would like to stress and hope that we will have certainly a follow-up, which in fact Ambassador Anis has also proposed. The structure is there, the framework is there, so we are ready but certainly we would also very much like to have the next one in Greece or in Athens or in Cyprus. Thank you very much.